Robert had been living on his 10 acres of land for 15 years before anyone else showed up. His property sat at the end of a quiet dirt road surrounded by open fields and the kind of peace you can't find in the city. He'd bought the place back when land was cheap and he could afford it on his civil engineer salary. The house wasn't fancy, just a simple ranch-style place with a big front porch where he'd sit with his coffee every morning, watching the sun come up over the fields. Life was exactly how Robert wanted it. He had his workshop in the back where he built furniture on weekends. He grew tomatoes and peppers in a small garden. His old dog, Bruno, would bark at the occasional deer that wandered through. It wasn't much, but it was his, and he'd worked hard for every bit of it. Then the developers came knocking. It was about 5 years ago, when a man in an expensive suit showed up at his door with a proposal. They wanted to build a new housing community and they needed land. Robert wasn't interested in selling at first. This was his home, his sanctuary. But the developer was persistent, coming back 3 times with better offers each time. Finally, Robert thought about it practically. He didn't need all 10 acres. His house in the area he actually used sat on about 4 acres. The rest was just empty field that he mowed a few times a year. The money they were offering was substantial, enough to pay off his mortgage completely and then some. So he agreed, but with conditions. His lawyer was thorough, maybe more thorough than the developers expected. Robert would sell 6 acres, but he'd keep the 4 where his house sat. More importantly, and this is where things get interesting, he'd keep ownership of the road. See, the dirt road that led from the highway to his property would now be the only way in and out of this new community. Robert owned it, always had. He agreed to let the new neighborhood use it, but it would stay his property. The papers were signed, the money changed hands, and Robert figured that was that. The construction started within months. Robert watched from his porch as the machinery moved in, clearing land and laying foundations. It was noisy and dusty for a while, but he didn't complain. He'd made his choice and gotten paid well for it. Besides, he figured once the houses were built, things would settle down and he'd have some neighbors. Maybe it would even be nice to have people around. The houses went up fast, all of them looking exactly the same. Cookie-cutter homes with beige siding and small yards packed together like sardines. Within a year, families started moving in. The community was called Meadowbrook, which Robert found funny because there wasn't a brook anywhere near the place. But that's what developers do. Give fancy names to make places sound better than they are. At first, things were fine. New neighbors would wave when they drove past. A few even stopped by to introduce themselves, bringing cookies or asking about the area. Robert was friendly, showing them where the good hiking trails were and warning them about the occasional flooding in spring. He thought maybe this would work out after all. Then Helen moved in. She bought the house closest to Robert's property line, and from day one she made it clear she had opinions about everything. Helen was the type of person who wore pearls to go grocery shopping and acted like she was running for mayor of a place she'd lived in for 5 minutes. She had perfectly styled gray hair, drove a luxury SUV that was always spotless, and carried a clipboard everywhere she went. Within 3 months of moving in, Helen had somehow gotten herself elected as president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. Robert didn't pay much attention to HOA stuff since he wasn't part of it, but he started hearing things. Helen was strict, real strict. She fined people for leaving their trash cans out too long. She made rules about what color people could paint their mailboxes. She even tried to ban certain types of flowers because they didn't fit her vision of the neighborhood. Robert first noticed something was wrong when he found a note stuck to his mailbox. It was typed up all official-looking on HOA letterhead. The note informed him that his lawn was in violation of community standards and needed to be cut to exactly 2.5 inches. Robert read it twice, confused. His lawn looked fine, maybe a bit longer than the tiny yards in Meadowbrook, but it was his property. He wasn't part of any HOA. He ignored the note, figuring it was a mistake. Maybe someone got confused about property lines. But then another note came, this time complaining about his truck. It was an older Ford, nothing fancy, but it ran fine. The note said vehicles over 10 years old couldn't be parked in view of the street because they were an eyesore. Robert was starting to get annoyed. He'd lived here 15 years and now someone was telling him his truck was too ugly for the neighborhood. The third note was about Bruno. His dog was apparently barking too much and disturbing the peace. Now Bruno was old and mostly slept on the porch. He'd bark if a squirrel got too close or when Robert came home from the hardware store. But that was about it. The note threatened fines if the noise continued. Robert decided it was time to talk to someone. He walked over to Helen's house one evening and knocked on her door. She answered with that tight smile people give when they're not actually happy to see you. "Can I help you?" she asked like he was a door-to-door salesman. "Yeah, I'm Robert. I live next door. Well, been living here for 15 years, actually. I wanted to talk about these notes." Helen's smile got even tighter. "Oh yes, we've been meaning to address the situation with your property. You see, Meadowbrook has standards and we expect everyone in the area to maintain them." Robert kept his cool. "I understand you have standards for your community, but I'm not part of the HOA. My property isn't in Meadowbrook. I own this land separately." Helen looked at him like he'd just said something stupid. "Nevertheless, your property is visible from our community, and it affects our property values. We need you to comply with our regulations." "Ma'am, I don't think you understand. I can't comply with HOA rules because I'm not in the HOA. I was here first. I sold the land that Meadowbrook sits on, but my property is separate." Her expression changed then from fake friendly to cold. "We'll see about that. The HOA board will be reviewing this matter. You'll be hearing from us." She closed the door in his face. Robert walked back home, shaking his head. He had a bad feeling about where this was headed, but he tried to stay positive. Surely once Helen understood the legal situation, she'd back off. He had no idea how wrong he was about that. Over the next few weeks, the notes kept coming, each one more demanding than the last. Helen seemed to think that if she just insisted hard enough, Robert would bend to her will. She didn't seem to grasp that her authority ended at the HOA boundaries, and his property was definitely outside those boundaries. Robert started keeping all the notes in a folder. Something told him he might need them later. What started as annoying notes turned into something much worse. Helen wasn't the type to give up when someone told her no. In fact, being told no seemed to make her more determined, like she'd taken it as a personal challenge. Robert had started a small project that spring. Nothing crazy, just building a new deck off the back of his house. The old one was rotting in places and needed replacing anyway. He'd gotten all the proper permits from the county, filled out the paperwork, paid the fees. Everything was done by the book because Robert had spent his career following regulations, and he knew how important it was to do things right. He was out there one Saturday morning, measuring boards and marking cuts when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around to find Helen standing there with a man in khakis and a polo shirt, with the Meadowbrook HOA logo on it. "Excuse me?" Helen said in that sharp voice of hers. "We need to see your approved plans for this construction." Robert straightened up, wiping sawdust off his hands. "My approved plans? I have permits from the county if that's what you mean." "No," she said, holding her clipboard like a weapon. "Your plans approved by the Meadowbrook Architectural Review Committee. All construction visible from HOA properties must be submitted for approval 30 days in advance." Robert felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice calm. "Helen, we've been through this. I'm not part of your HOA. I don't need approval from your committee. I need approval from the county, which I have." He walked to his truck and pulled out the permits from the glove box, showing them the official stamps and signatures. The man with Helen looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to be anywhere else. Helen's face was turning red. "This is unacceptable. You can't just build whatever you want. There are rules." "You're right, there are rules," Robert agreed. "County rules, building codes, zoning regulations. I'm following all of them. What I'm not following are HOA rules that don't apply to me." Helen practically shook with anger. "We'll see about that. The HOA will be filing complaints with the county. We'll be pursuing fines. We'll place a lien on your property if necessary." Robert had heard enough. "You do what you need to do, but you're wasting your time and probably HOA money on lawyers. My property, my rules, as long as I follow county regulations." They left, Helen muttering under her breath while the other guy apologized quietly. Robert went back to work, but the joy had gone out of the project. He couldn't just enjoy building his deck anymore. Now every time he picked up a hammer, he was looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next confrontation, and the confrontations kept coming. Helen filed a noise complaint with the county, claiming Robert was running loud machinery at all hours. An inspector came out looking tired and annoyed. Robert showed him his work schedule, all reasonable daylight hours, and his equipment just basic carpentry tools. The complaint was dismissed. Then Helen reported him to the zoning board, claiming he was running an illegal business out of his home. Another inspector showed up. Robert explained he just built furniture as a hobby, Sold a piece now and then to friends, but it wasn't a business. That complaint was dismissed too. Next was the vegetable garden. Helen claimed it violated aesthetic guidelines and was bringing down property values. Robert had planted tomatoes, peppers, some lettuce, green beans. Normal garden stuff. He'd had that garden for 10 years, long before Meadowbrook existed. The county told Helen that vegetable gardens weren't illegal and to stop wasting their time. Each complaint meant Robert had to take time off, wait around for inspectors, dig through his files to prove he wasn't doing anything wrong. It was harassment, plain and simple, but Helen seemed to think she was on some kind of mission. Robert started documenting everything. Every note, every complaint, every visit. He wrote down dates and times. He took photos. Something told him this was building to something bigger. The other HOA residents started noticing too. A few of them apologized to Robert when they'd see him at the gas station or hardware store. "We had no idea Helen was doing this," they'd say. "She told us you were causing problems, but now we're hearing a different story." Robert appreciated the support, but it didn't stop Helen. If anything, she got worse. She started showing up at his property line with a camera, taking pictures of his house, his truck, his garden, his dog, just standing there photographing everything. It was creepy and invasive, but technically she was on HOA property, so there wasn't much he could do about it. One afternoon, Robert was working in his garden when Helen appeared with her camera again. He tried to ignore her, but after 10 minutes of hearing that camera click, he'd had enough. "Can I help you with something?" he called over. "Just documenting violations," she replied sweetly. "The HOA board needs evidence." "Evidence of what?" "Me growing tomatoes? That's not a violation of anything. That's for the board to decide. And the authorities if necessary." That word hung in the air. Authorities. It felt like a threat, and it probably was. Robert went inside and called his lawyer. They'd done the original land sale together, and Robert trusted him. He explained the situation, all the harassment, the constant complaints, Helen's threats. His lawyer listened carefully. "Robert, keep documenting everything. What she's doing is harassment, and it might be actionable. More importantly, you need to remember something. You own that access road. It's in the original agreement. The HOA has permission to use it, but it's your property." Robert had almost forgotten about that detail. The road seemed like such a small thing compared to everything else going on, but his lawyer was right. That road was the only way in and out of Meadowbrook. Without it, all those houses would be landlocked, worthless. "I don't want to be that guy," Robert said. "I don't want to threaten people or use the road as leverage." "I'm not saying you should," his lawyer replied. "I'm just reminding you that you have options. And if Helen keeps pushing, you might need to remind her that she's not the only one with power here." Robert thought about that conversation for days. He didn't want to escalate things. He just wanted to be left alone on his own property, the same property he'd owned for 15 years. But Helen seemed determined to make his life miserable, and he was getting tired of being patient. The final straw came on a Tuesday afternoon. Robert was changing the oil in his truck, a simple maintenance job he'd done 100 times. He had the truck up on ramps, oil pan underneath, and he was just loosening the drain plug when he heard sirens. 2 police cars pulled into his driveway. Robert's heart jumped. What now? He slid out from under the truck, oil on his hands, and stood up slowly. He could see Helen across the yard, standing by her fence with her arms crossed and that satisfied look on her face. 2 officers got out of their cars, hands near their belts but not threatening. They looked at Robert, then at Helen, then back at Robert. "Sir," the older officer said, "we received some calls about your property. Can we talk to you for a minute?" Robert nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Of course. What's this about?" The younger officer checked his notepad. "We have reports of illegal construction, possible theft of HOA property, and disturbing the peace. Multiple complaints filed over the past several weeks." Robert felt his face get hot, but he kept his voice level. "Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. All my construction is permitted by the county. I haven't stolen anything from anyone, and I'm not disturbing any peace, but I can show you documentation for everything if you want to see it." The older officer nodded. That would be helpful, actually. Robert led them to his workshop where he kept his filing cabinets. Years of being an engineer had taught him to keep good records, and he was grateful for that habit now. He pulled out folders showing his property deed, the land sale agreement, all his building permits, the county inspection reports clearing him of all Helen's complaints. The officers took their time, reading through everything carefully. Robert could see them exchanging glances, understanding dawning on their faces. This wasn't a criminal matter. This was a neighbor dispute, and they were being used as pawns in someone's petty war. Just to confirm, the older officer said, "You've owned this property for 15 years? And it was never part of the Meadowbrook HOA?" "That's correct," Robert replied. "I sold part of my original land to the developers, but I kept this parcel. It's completely separate from the HOA." The younger officer looked at his notes again, then at the property map Robert had shown them. "And this access road that connects to the highway, who owns that?" Robert took a deep breath. "I do. It's part of my original property. I granted the HOA an easement to use it so residents could access their homes. But the road itself is mine." The officers looked at each other. The older one actually smiled a little. "Well, that's interesting." They walked back outside, and Robert watched as they approached Helen. He couldn't hear everything being said, but he could see Helen's expression change from confident to confused to angry. She was gesturing wildly, pointing at Robert's property at her clipboard, clearly arguing with the officers. The conversation went on for several minutes before the officers came back to Robert. "Sir, we apologize for the inconvenience. It's clear there's no criminal activity here. This is a civil matter between neighbors. However, given the pattern of false reports, you might want to consult with an attorney about harassment. Robert, thank." After the police left, Robert sat on his porch for a long time, just thinking. Bruno laid down next to him, sensing something was wrong. Robert scratched behind the old dog's ears and tried to figure out his next move. He'd been patient, maybe too patient. He'd tried being reasonable, showing documentation, following every rule. None of it mattered to Helen. She was going to keep coming at him until something changed. That evening, Robert pulled out all the paperwork from the original land sale. He hadn't looked at it in years, hadn't needed to, but now he read through every page carefully, paying special attention to the sections his lawyer had marked as important. The access road agreement was interesting, really interesting. His lawyer had put in some specific language that Robert hadn't fully appreciated at the time. The road would remain private property. That was clear. The HOA had permission to use it, but that permission came with conditions. Robert had the right to maintain control over the road. More importantly, and this is what caught his attention now, the agreement could be terminated if the HOA or its representatives engaged in harassment or attempted to exert authority over his retained property. Robert read that section 3 times. His lawyer had apparently anticipated this exact situation. The developers had been in such a hurry to close the deal that they'd agreed to whatever legal terms were proposed. And now those terms gave Robert leverage, real leverage. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday night. Robert had never attended one before. He'd figured it wasn't his business, wasn't his community. But things had changed. Helen had made it his business when she started harassing him. It was time to show her that he wasn't powerless. Thursday evening, Robert put on clean jeans and a button-up shirt. He grabbed his leather folder with all his documents and walked over to the Meadowbrook Community Center. It was a small building at the entrance of the neighborhood, mostly used for HOA meetings and the occasional birthday party. He could hear voices inside when he approached. Through the window, he could see about 15 people sitting in folding chairs. Helen stood at the front next to a table, her ever-present clipboard in hand. Robert took a breath and opened the door. The room went quiet. Everyone turned to look at him. Helen's eyes went wide, then narrow. Her face flushed red. "This is a closed meeting," she announced, her voice sharp. "HOA members only. You need to leave immediately." Robert walked calmly to an empty chair in the back and sat down. He placed his folder on his lap and looked directly at Helen. "Actually, as the owner of the private road that provides sole access to this community, I have a vested interest in HOA decisions. I'm here as an observer, which is my right as the property owner." The room erupted in whispers. People turned to each other, confused. Robert could hear snippets of conversation. "What does he mean, his road? I thought the HOA owned the access road. Is that true?" Helen banged a wooden gavel on the table. "That's nonsense. The road is HOA property. Now leave before I call the police again." Robert didn't move. "Feel free to call them if you want, but you might want to check your community's founding documents first. The deed for this development specifically, you'll find that the access road is listed as a private easement Granted by the adjacent property owner. That's me. One of the board members, a nervous-looking man named George, was frantically typing on his laptop. His face went pale as he read something on the screen. "Helen," he said quietly, "I'm looking at the county property records right now." "He's right. The road is listed under his property tax parcel." The room went completely silent. Helen looked like she'd been slapped. "That can't be right. The developer never mentioned that. Did you ask?" Robert said calmly. "Did anyone on the board actually review the property documents when they took their positions?" George shook his head slowly. Several other board members looked at each other nervously. It was becoming clear that none of them had any idea about this detail. Helen had been running the HOA like her personal kingdom, and apparently, nobody had questioned her enough to discover this issue. Helen recovered quickly, straightening her spine. "Fine, so you own the road. That doesn't change anything. This meeting is still for HOA members only, and you're not a member." "True," Robert agreed. "I'm not asking to vote or make decisions. I'm just here to observe. But since we're all here, there's something the board should know." He opened his folder and pulled out copies of documents. He stood and started handing them to people in the room. Helen tried to stop him, but the other board members were already reaching for the papers, curious. "These are copies of the original easement agreement," Robert explained, "the one that allows Meadowbrook residents to use my road. I want everyone to understand the terms, since it seems like this information was never shared with the community." People read quickly, eyes moving over the legal language. Robert watched as understanding spread through the room. The easement could be terminated. That's what everyone was realizing. Without that road, their houses would be landlocked. There was no other way in or out. The highway was on one side and Robert's property wrapped around the rest of Meadowbrook. "You're threatening us," Helen said, her voice shaking with anger. "You're trying to intimidate the board." "I'm not threatening anyone," Robert replied evenly. "I'm providing information. The board and residents should know the legal situation. They should also know that the agreement includes a clause about harassment." He paused, letting that sink in. "Harassment of the property owner by the HOA or its representatives is grounds for termination of the easement." George was reading the document carefully now. "Helen, have you been filing complaints against him with the county?" Helen's face was crimson. "He's been violating community standards." "He's not in the community," another board member said, a woman named Claire. "His property is separate. You told us he was part of Meadowbrook and just refusing to follow rules." "The perception is the same," Helen snapped. "His property affects our property values." Robert spoke up again. "Over the past 6 months, the HOA president has filed 14 separate complaints against me with county authorities. All were dismissed as frivolous. She's left numerous notes on my property, called the police on false pretenses, and photographed my home and activities without permission. I have documentation of all of it." He pulled out another stack of papers, this time showing the timeline of harassment he'd been documenting. Photos of the notes, copies of the dismissed county complaints, even a few photos he'd taken of Helen standing at his property line with her camera. Claire took the papers and read through them, her expression growing more concerned with each page. "Helen, is this true?" "I was protecting the community," Helen insisted. "Someone has to maintain standards." "Standards?" George said, his voice rising. "You've been harassing our neighbor and apparently risking our access road in the process? Did you not think about the consequences?" Other residents started speaking up now, their voices overlapping. Some had their own complaints about Helen's leadership, fines for minor violations, rules that seemed to appear out of nowhere, money spent without board approval. It was like opening a dam. Once people felt safe to speak up, everything came pouring out. Robert sat back down and let them talk. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about a community discovering that their HOA president had been operating without oversight, making decisions that put everyone at risk. Helen tried to regain control, banging her gavel and shouting for order, but nobody was listening anymore. Finally, George stood up and took the gavel from her hand. "I think we need to have a board-only discussion," he said firmly. "Helen, Robert, everyone else, please wait outside." Robert gathered his papers and walked out. Helen followed, her face still red, muttering under her breath about ungrateful neighbors and legal action. Robert went and sat on a bench outside the community center, looking at the stars. It was a clear night, quiet except for the muffled voices coming from inside the building. Other residents came outside too, some of them approaching Robert. A younger couple apologized for not speaking up sooner. An older man thanked him for bringing the situation to light. A woman asked if he was really going to take away the road access. "I don't want to take away anything," Robert told them honestly. "I just want to be left alone on my property. That's all I've ever wanted." The meeting went on for another 2 hours. Robert could hear raised voices at times, heated discussions. Eventually the door opened and George stepped out looking exhausted. "Robert, could you come back in for a minute?" Robert walked back into the community center. The mood had completely changed. Helen was sitting in the back row now, arms crossed, looking defeated. The other board members were at the front table. Claire spoke first. "We owe you an apology. We had no idea about the harassment, and we certainly didn't know about the road situation. The board has voted to remove Helen from her position as president and from the board entirely, effective immediately." Helen stood up abruptly. "You can't do that." "We just did," George said quietly. It was unanimous among the remaining board members. Helen grabbed her clipboard and her bag and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The room relaxed noticeably once she was gone. George turned to Robert. "We'd like to discuss the road situation with you. Obviously, we need to make sure." The week after the meeting, Robert couldn't help but notice the change in atmosphere around Meadowbrook. People waved when they drove past his property. A few neighbors stopped by to chat, apologizing again for what had happened. One couple even brought him a homemade pie, which Bruno eyed hopefully from the porch. But the most interesting development came from unexpected conversations. As residents learned the truth about Helen's actions, they started talking among themselves. And what they discovered wasn't pretty. George called Robert on Tuesday afternoon. "Hey, we've been going through the HOA finances and records. Can I ask you something? Did Helen ever contact you about any official business before she started the harassment? Like legitimate HOA concerns?" Robert thought about it. "No, never. The first contact I had was that note about my lawn." "Why?" There was a pause on the other end. "Because according to the meeting minutes, Helen told the board multiple times that she'd reached out to you diplomatically, and you'd been hostile and threatening. She used that to justify her actions." Robert felt his jaw tighten. "That's a complete lie. I tried to talk to her once early on and she shut me down. After that, it was all notes and complaints." "Yeah, that's what we're figuring out. Listen, we're finding other issues too. Money spent without board approval, rules she enforced that aren't actually in our bylaws. We're going to need to do a full audit and review." George sighed. "This is a mess." The meeting with the lawyers was scheduled for the following Monday. Robert arrived at the community center with his lawyer, Dan, who'd handled the original land sale. The new HOA board was already there, along with their own attorney, a professional-looking woman named Linda. "Thank you for coming," Claire said, shaking hands with both of them. "We want to start by saying again how sorry we are for what you've been through. Once we started digging, we realized Helen had misrepresented a lot of things to the board." They sat around a table, and Linda opened her laptop. "We've reviewed the original easement agreement and consulted with the HOA's legal counsel. Mr. Thompson is well within his rights to terminate the easement based on the harassment clause. However, we're hoping we can reach a new agreement that works for everyone." Dan leaned forward. "What are you proposing?" Linda pulled up a document. "We'd like to offer a permanent easement with stronger protections. The HOA would acknowledge in writing that Robert's property is separate and not subject to HOA regulations. We'd include specific anti-harassment language with penalties if any HOA representative or resident violates his property rights. In exchange, Robert would grant permanent road access to the community." Robert looked at Dan, who was reading through the document on his tablet. "What about maintenance?" Dan asked. "The road crosses Robert's property. Who's responsible for upkeep?" George spoke up. "We'd like to propose a shared maintenance agreement. The HOA would handle repairs and upkeep for the portions of the road within Meadowbrook and the section on Robert's property. We'd coordinate any major work with him in advance." "What about costs?" Robert asked. "I don't want to be paying for road maintenance for a whole neighborhood." "No cost to you," Claire assured him. "The HOA would cover all expenses for road maintenance. We'd include that in our annual budget. We'd also want language that prevents any future board from trying what Helen did." Dan nodded slowly. "This sounds reasonable, but I want to add some additional protections. First, Any HOA complaints about Robert's property must go through the board for approval before being filed with county authorities. No individual HOA member can file complaints on behalf of the HOA without board vote. Second, if there's ever a legitimate concern about Robert's property affecting the community, there must be a mediation process before any legal action. Third, Robert retains the right to revoke the easement if these terms are violated, with a 90-day notice period to give residents time to address the situation. Linda made notes. I think we can work with all of that. The board wants this resolved fairly. We're also planning some major changes to how the HOA operates. They spent the next 2 hours working through the details. Dan and Linda negotiated specific language, while Robert and the board members answered questions and clarified concerns. By the end, they had a framework that everyone felt good about. We'll draft the formal agreement and send it to both parties for review, Linda said. Hopefully we can have this finalized within 2 weeks. As they were packing up to leave, George pulled Robert aside. There's something else you should know. Helen put her house up for sale yesterday. Robert raised his eyebrows. That was fast. Yeah, well, word got around about what happened. People aren't exactly friendly to her anymore. I heard she's already gotten into arguments with 3 different neighbors. I think she realizes she can't stay here. Robert felt a small twinge of something. Not quite sympathy, but not satisfaction either. I didn't want to drive her out. I just wanted her to leave me alone. I know, George said, but Helen couldn't handle being wrong. She couldn't face living here after everyone learned the truth. That's on her, not you. After the meeting, Robert and Dan sat in Dan's car for a few minutes reviewing what had happened. You handled this well, Dan said. A lot of people would have just pulled the road access out of anger. I thought about it, Robert admitted. But those people in there, most of them had no idea what Helen was doing. It wouldn't be fair to punish them. The new agreement is solid. Much better than the original, actually. You'll have real protections this time. Dan grinned. And the HOA's paying for your road maintenance. That's going to save you money every year. Robert laughed. I didn't even think about that part. Yeah, that's not bad. Over the next week, Robert watched the changes happening in Meadowbrook. Helen's for sale sign went up, and apparently, she was motivated to sell quickly because the price dropped twice. Meanwhile, the HOA held another community meeting, this time open to all residents. Robert didn't attend that one, but George filled him in later. The board had presented their findings about Helen's mismanagement. Money had been spent on things that weren't approved, some of it on legal consultations for her vendetta against Robert. Rules had been created and enforced that weren't actually in the HOA bylaws. People had been fined unfairly. The residents voted to do a complete overhaul of the HOA. They'd review every rule, revise the bylaws, and implement better oversight of the board. Several people volunteered for a new oversight committee to make sure no future president could operate with the kind of unchecked power Helen had wielded. People are actually excited about it, George told Robert over coffee one afternoon. Robert had invited him over to see the deck he'd finished building. The same deck that had started so much trouble. It's like everyone realized they'd been living under this oppressive system, and now they have a chance to build something better. How's Helen taking all this? Robert asked, handing George a cup. Not well. She's been posting on social media about how ungrateful everyone is, how she sacrificed for this community. Nobody's engaging with her, though. Her house should close in a few weeks, and then she'll be gone. The formal easement agreement came through 10 days later. Robert and Dan reviewed every word carefully. It was thorough, protecting Robert's rights while giving the community the security they needed. The anti-harassment provisions were strong. The maintenance agreement was clear. The escape clauses gave Robert protection if things ever went wrong again. Robert signed it, the board signed it, and it was filed with the county. The road was settled, the harassment would stop, and life could finally return to normal. But the story didn't quite end there. A few weeks later, Robert was in his garden when he heard someone call his name. He looked up to see Claire and another woman walking toward him. Robert, do you have a minute? Claire asked. Sure, what's up? This is Monica. She's taking over as HOA president. The woman was younger than Helen, probably in her 40s with a warm smile and casual clothes. Nice to meet you, Monica said, shaking his hand. I wanted to introduce myself and ask you something. We're planning a community barbecue next month, kind of a fresh start thing. Would you want to come? We'd love to have you. Robert was surprised. I'm not part of the HOA, though. No, but you're our neighbor, Monica said. And honestly, after everything that happened, we want to show you that we're not all like Helen. We want to be good neighbors. Robert thought about it. His first instinct was to say no, to keep to himself like he always had. But looking at their hopeful faces, he realized something. The community had changed. They'd stood up to Helen, fixed their problems, and now they were trying to do better. Yeah, he said finally. I'll come. Can I bring my dog? Claire laughed. Absolutely. Bruno's welcome anytime. As they walked away, Robert looked around his property. The deck was finished. The garden was growing well. Bruno was asleep on the porch in his favorite spot. Everything was exactly as it should be, the way he'd wanted it all along. Peaceful. Quiet. His. But now, instead of feeling isolated, he felt like part of something. Not part of the HOA, he'd never want that, but part of a community that had learned to respect boundaries and treat people right. It had taken a fight to get there, and he hadn't wanted that fight. But now that it was over, things were actually better than before. Helen's house S. The community barbecue was scheduled for the first Saturday in July. Robert almost talked himself out of going about a dozen times that week. He wasn't much for crowds, and the idea of walking into a gathering of HOA residents still felt weird. But he'd promised, and Robert kept his promises. He showed up at noon with Bruno on a leash and a bowl of his homemade potato salad. Monica had set everything up in the common area near the community center. There were grills going, kids running around, music playing from someone's portable speaker. It looked like a normal neighborhood party, the kind Robert had seen in movies but never really experienced. You came. Monica waved him over to the food table. And you brought food. You didn't have to do that. My mom's recipe, Robert said, setting down the bowl. Fair warning, it's got a kick to it. People started coming over to say hello. Some he recognized from the meetings, others were new faces. Everyone was friendly, though Robert could tell some were still a bit awkward about the whole situation. How do you casually chat with the neighbor your old HOA president tried to destroy? But as the afternoon went on, things got easier. Robert found himself talking to Doug, a retired teacher who lived 3 houses down from where Helen used to live. They discovered they both liked fishing, and ended up swapping stories about the best spots in the county. A couple with young kids asked if they could pet Bruno, who ate up the attention like the old ham he was. George found Robert later, pulling him aside with a grin. I have news. You're not going to believe this. What now? You know how we did that full audit of HOA finances? We found some irregularities. Nothing huge, but enough that we brought it to our lawyer. George lowered his voice. Turns out Helen had been paying herself for services she never actually performed. Consulting fees, administrative costs, stuff like that. Over 3 years, she'd taken about $15,000. Robert whistled. What are you going to do? The board voted to pursue it. We're not trying to be vindictive, but that's money that came from residents' HOA dues. It should have gone to community improvements. We sent her a demand letter. How'd she respond? George's grin widened. She paid it back within a week. Full amount. I think she realized that fighting it would mean admitting what she did, and that could lead to bigger problems for her. Paying it back quietly was her best option. Robert shook his head. All that power she had, all that control, and she was stealing the whole time. Yeah. Makes you wonder if the control was the point or if it was just about the money. George grabbed a burger from the grill. Either way, she's gone and we're better off. As the party continued, Robert noticed something interesting. The HOA residents weren't just being friendly to him out of obligation or guilt. They genuinely seemed to like having him around. People asked his advice about fixing things since he had tools and experience. Parents asked if he'd be willing to help with a woodworking class for kids interested in learning. Someone even asked if he'd consider joining the neighborhood watch program. It was strange being welcomed into a community that had tried so hard to push him out. But this wasn't the same community anymore. Helen's removal had been like lancing a wound. All the poison had come out, and now things could heal properly. Claire found him later, sitting on a bench with Bruno at his feet. Can I ask you something personal? She said, sitting down. Sure. Why didn't you just revoke the road access? When Helen was at her worst, you could have made their lives hell. You had every right to, legally. But you didn't. Why? Robert scratched Bruno's head, thinking. Because it wouldn't have solved anything. Helen was the problem, not the people living here. Taking away the road would have hurt families, kids, people who never did anything to me. That's not who I want to be. Claire nodded slowly. That's what I thought. You're a good person, Robert. We're lucky to have you as a neighbor. After she walked away, Robert sat there for a while watching the party. Kids were playing tag. Adults were laughing and talking. The grills were still smoking. It was nice, really nice. He'd spent 15 years on his property enjoying the peace and quiet, and that was good. But this was good too, in a different way. The changes in Meadowbrook continued over the summer. The new board was serious about reform. They held monthly open meetings where any resident could voice concerns. They published financial reports online so everyone could see where money was going. They revised the bylaws to be more reasonable, eliminating some of Helen's more ridiculous rules. The new regulations were actually sensible.
Keep your yard reasonably maintained.
Don't disturb neighbors with excessive noise after 10 p.m. Basic stuff that any decent neighbor would do anyway. Gone were the rules about specific paint colors, approved plant lists, and vehicle age restrictions. Robert watched it all from a distance, impressed by how seriously people were taking it. They weren't just fixing the HOA, they were building something better, learning from what went wrong. In August, something unexpected happened. Robert was in his workshop when Monica knocked on his door. Hey, sorry to bother you. Can I ask a favor? What's up? We're having an issue with the road. There's a section that's really deteriorating. Needs more than just patching. We got quotes and it's pretty expensive. I wanted to let you know before we start the work since it's technically on your property. Robert appreciated her coming to him directly. How much are we talking? About $8,000 for the full repair. It's a bigger job than we budgeted for this year. Monica looked uncomfortable. We can do it, but it means cutting back on some other planned improvements. Robert thought for a minute. What if we split it? I'll pay $4,000, you guys pay $4,000. It is my road after all, even if you're maintaining it. And I drive on it every day too. Monica's eyes widened. You don't have to do that. The agreement says we cover maintenance. I know what the agreement says, but we're neighbors, right? Neighbors help each other out. Monica smiled, looking genuinely touched. Thank you. That's really generous. The road repair happened in September. Robert even helped out a bit, lending some tools and advice. A few other residents pitched in too, making it a community project. It reminded Robert of the old days before everything became so complicated. When neighbors just helped each other because that's what you did. October brought the first anniversary of Helen's removal from the board. Nobody celebrated it officially, but there was a noticeable sense of relief in the air. A whole year of functioning normally, of treating each other with respect, of running an HOA that actually helped the community instead of controlling it. Robert was on his porch one Saturday morning when a car pulled up. A young couple got out looking at the house that used to be Helen's. A realtor was showing them around. They waved at Robert and he waved back. New neighbors. The cycle continuing. That evening, George stopped by with beers like he'd started doing most weekends. They'd become real friends over the past year. Did you ever think it would turn out like this? George asked, sitting on the deck. Like what? You know, all of it. The fight with Helen. The changes to the HOA, you actually being part of the community now. Robert took a sip of his beer, thinking, honestly? No, when Helen started her campaign, I just wanted it to stop. I wanted my quiet life back. I never imagined it would lead to all this. Do you regret it? Getting involved, I mean? No, Robert said, and he realized he meant it. I regret that it had to happen the way it did. I wish Helen had just left me alone from the start. But the outcome? This is better than before. Not just for me, for everyone, George nodded. Helen's living in a condo across town now. I heard she tried to get elected to that HOA board, but they turned her down. Apparently, word got around about what happened here. Robert didn't feel satisfaction at hearing that, but he didn't feel bad either. Helen had made her choices. She'd chosen to harass him, to abuse her power, to steal from her community. The consequences were her own doing. You know what's funny? Robert said. Helen spent all that time trying to force me out, trying to make me comply with her rules, trying to prove she had power over me. And in the end, all she did was lose everything while I'm still here on my land, living exactly how I want. Karma, George said, raising his beer. She forgot the most important rule. What's that? Don't mess with the man who owns the only road out of town. They both laughed at that. Bruno, old and content on his bed, wagged his tail in his sleep. As the sun set over his property, Robert looked around at everything he'd built. The house he'd owned for 16 years now. The workshop where he made furniture. The garden that was putting out its last vegetables of the season. The deck where he sat with his friend, drinking beer and enjoying the evening. This was his land. His home, his life. Helen had tried to take it from him, tried to bend him to her will. She'd failed spectacularly, losing her position, her reputation, her home, and even money in the process. But Robert wasn't thinking about Helen anymore. She was gone, a bad memory fading with time. He was thinking about the community barbecue next month, about the woodworking class he'd agreed to teach to interested kids, about the fishing trip he and Doug were planning, about the new neighbors moving into Helen's old house who might actually be decent people. He'd fought for his right to be left alone, to live peacefully on his own property by his own rule.